This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 728, entitled "The Student Body Will Turn Against Women's Studies Departments." Description: as masculinist ideas spread increasingly across the culture, a tipping point will be reached on campus to the point that biconscious masculists turn against monoconscious feminist women's studies departments and professors, seen as the source of society's misandry. These professors' lives will be made such a misery that they will be forced to become biconscious or be fired. The biconsciousing of campuses will greatly increase the level of likeability of female university students, so that young men start dating them again. The student body will turn against women's studies departments, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. As masculinist ideas spread across the culture, as nearly all men are infected by the masculinist virus, as most men become conscious that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, that women oppress men as well, and in fact far worse than vice versa, then monoconscious feminism will be seen by men increasingly as hypocritical, as bigoted, as unacceptable, and something to be removed from society, starting with the universities. Most social movements start in universities, since universities consist of large concentrations of smart young people with open, influenceable minds, where new ideas can spread quickly and effectively. In the 70s, feminist ideas spread rapidly through universities, since female university students read books. They read feminist books and were strongly influenced by them, so brought their newly hatched feminist attitudes towards other women, towards men, towards university administration, pushing for the establishment of women's studies programs that would study the systematic suppression of women's rights in history, in society, by men. Today, there are thousands of women's studies departments in universities across the planet, which teach, largely young women, how men oppress women. So not surprisingly, these young women become angry at men for the ways that men oppress women. A tiny minority of these women, in turn, become women's studies professors, who have read literally hundreds of feminist books on how men oppress women, so are powerfully aware just how badly men oppress women. So not surprisingly, are deeply misandrist due to their extensive knowledge of just how greatly men oppress women. They are full of case studies and stats on how men oppress women. This was in the 70s and 80s. Now fast forward to today and consider how universities will soon change, given the rise and rise of the manosphere, that is, men on the internet, talking about men's issues, talking about the other half of gender politics, that is, masculism, and how women oppress men, far worse. Monoconscious feminists usually interpret masculist criticism of women as just more misogyny, and are highly resistant towards it, trying to suppress it as something highly sexist, misogynistic, and contemptible. Biconscious masculists, in brackets, who by definition are equally informed about masculist ideas as feminist ideas, close brackets, see this resistance coming from the monoconscious feminists towards masculist criticism of women as pure hypocrisy, as bigotry, given the masculist belief that women oppress men far worse, brackets. For example, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc., close brackets, so are enraged at the hypocrisy of feminists' public trashing of men, when these masculists see clearly that women oppress men worse. We are now seeing a rising tide on campus of masculist criticism and expressions of hatred towards monoconscious feminists. There's a growing awareness on the part of masculist male university students that the real source of feminist misandry is women's studies departments, women's studies professors, who teach millions of young women how badly men oppress women and mention nothing, in capital letters, nothing at all, about how women oppress men. The very idea that women oppress men just does not appear on such women's studies professors' radar. Masculist male students see this total ignorance of masculist ideas on the part of these monoconscious feminist women's studies professors and are angry towards them for their profound ignorance and for, quote, poisoning the minds of their female student colleagues, making them undateable, end quote. Soon there will be a tipping point when a sufficiently high percentage of male university students will have been masculisted and hence have become intolerant of feminist monoconsciousness, that is, intolerant of feminist ignorance of how much worse women oppress men. That these male students will feel the final straw that breaks the camel's back and then rebel in a tsunami of masculist male rage, taking back the universities in the sense of masculisting it, in a way similar to what happened with the feministing of universities in the 70s, once a sizable proportion of the female student population had absorbed feminist ideas from their reading of feminist books. In today's world, male university students get their ideas largely from the internet, with its video and talking heads, which spread ideas overnight and to great effect. Research shows that once the smartest 10% of the population accepts a new idea, a new ideology, then usually the rest of the population follows behind, influenced by the ideological leaders. Typically, this conversion process starts with intellectuals crying in the wilderness. Then small interest groups are started that are influenced by these intellectuals. Then the journalists catch on and write about these new ideas, brackets, which interestingly enough is not happening in the case of the rise of masculism due to the influence of the femmafia, that is, the feminist media mafia. In Western countries now, the majority of journalists and media people are women who are monoconscious feminists, who see any criticism of women coming from men, from masculists, as just expression of more misogyny. So they censor any attempt by masculist authors to spread masculist ideas in the mainstream media, close brackets. Once the journalists start spreading these new ideas to the masses, millions of people become influenced by the new thinking and then start exercising political pressure on the politicians to change the laws so that the new ideas can be implemented publicly, thus changing the lives of millions. This process happened with the feminists in the 70s and 80s. They moved on from their consciousness-raising circles at universities in the late 60s and early 70s to getting gender laws changed in the 70s and 80s. For example, equal pay for equal work, the right for women to enter the professions, the abortion right, the takeover of the divorce courts, the introduction of fault-free divorce, the establishment of women's studies programs at universities, often euphemistically relabeled as gender studies programs, etc. We're about to see something similar happen to men, as the inflection point will soon be reached in which enough male students on campus have been masculisted that they are able to express their collective anger and hatred against monoconscious feminist misandry for all its gender political ignorance that is, ignorance of masculist ideas, and rebel against it. Where will this collective masculist campus anger be directed towards? I think the obvious target of this biconscious masculist hatred will be directed towards the women's studies departments, towards the women's studies professors who will be verbally attacked by highly intelligent, highly articulate, biconscious masculists who will scream at these women who have been preaching monoconscious feminist misandry for decades. Masculist lawyers will soon be suing universities for their misandry, demanding that either women's studies departments be denied funding so that their feminist professors are fired, or that gender studies departments be forced to accept that there are two genders which need to be studied, so that masculist, brackets usually male, professors get to teach masculist ideas to their students, so that millions of young men and women learn that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. We can expect to see over the next few years a growing call on the part of the masculist male university students to their universities' administrations to make their gender studies department biconscious, that is, that both masculist and feminist ideas be taught, so that students learn that gender oppression is a two-way street. This biconsciousing will be a very bitter pill to swallow for monoconscious feminist professors who, for decades, have been teaching monoconscious feminist ideas to millions of young women, thus helping to poison the dating market for young men, who now see a whole generation of young monoconscious feminist women as undateable. Many of these monoconscious feminist gender studies professors will suffer a bad case of cognitive dissonance, as they are forced to accept the idea that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that women oppress men worse than vice versa. They'll be forced to become biconscious themselves, due to the overwhelming moral pressure coming from the male portion of their campuses. The longer a university's gender studies department remains monoconscious, the greater will be the hatred coming from the male students against them, to the point where it becomes overwhelming and crushing. Individual monoconscious feminist women's studies professors will become well known on campus and subsequently become the target of male masculist anger and hatred. These women will be catcalled, spat at, have their car tyres let down, car windows smashed, splashed with red paint, etc. Their lives will be made a misery until they become biconscious. Their boyfriends, husbands, partners, if they have one, will be targeted by masculist activists who send masculist videos to them, aiming to convert these currently monoconscious male feminist partners to biconsciousness by exposing them to masculist ideas, so that they see their monoconscious feminist girlfriends as hypocrites, as bigots, and then dump them. When men become collectively angry at women, especially at monoconscious feminist gender studies professors, then God help them. Men have 20 times the testosterone levels in their blood than women, so can be terrifyingly aggressive when enraged, scaring the shit out of women, who then fear for their physical survival. Women evolved to be scared of a very angry man who could kill her easily with one bash of his club. Once the monoconscious women's studies departments have been removed or converted to biconsciousness, then the level of misandry on campuses will diminish, which is why biconscious masculists want such monoconscious departments removed in the first place. Young women will then be a lot less misandrist and hence be nicer towards men. These biconscious female university students will then be a lot more willing to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, for the reform of the divorce courts that currently are so toxic for men, for the creation of GECs, Gender Equality Committees in the parliaments, that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes will be dealt with equally, which is by far not the case today. With the gender laws made men fair, for example, men given the paternity rejection right, and the OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's awful gender crime of paternity fraud, and the divorce courts as well, then young men will be a lot more willing to be fathers again, so that the birth rate does not continue to plummet, thus wiping out whole populations. Politicians will see that the biconsciousing of society is vital to avoid the catastrophic population collapse that we are currently witnessing, especially in South Korea, when the birth rate is now only 0.7 children per woman. These politicians will then men fair the gender laws and liberate millions of men. All this profound gender political change will start in the campuses, where male students rebel against the misandry of the women's studies departments and either get rid of them or convert them to biconsciousness. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, click on the Masculist tab for 720 plus Masculist essays and their videos. Google the terms London Real and Hugo de Garis to see videos on masculism at AI will kill 1 billion people